I was going to kick off, in any case, with a famous quote from Keynes's General Theory written in 1936, which I think is very relevant to what we're doing here today. He said, "Economic ideas, both when they're right and when they're wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Practical men who believe themselves exempt from any intellectual influence are often the slaves of some defunct economists. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler a few years back." I think it's hard to imagine a better description of the public policy environment all over the world in recent years, not least here in Scotland, I think over the last few months of the referendum debate. And the organization that I represent here, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, whose governing board I've been chairing since its foundation in 2010, and it was actually founded at a big international plenary conference at King's College, Cambridge, partly to reflect those sentences that I started out with. It was really set up after the financial crisis to try to change this environment by creating some kind of intellectual space for a change in economic ideas and to break the monopoly of the present monolithic paradigm of efficient markets, rational expectations, perfect competition, and free enterprise. And to see just how powerful and monolithic that paradigm is, think about those words that I've used and the Orwellian use of language: efficient markets, perfect competition, free enterprise, rational expectations. What could be better than rationality, perfection, efficiency, and freedom? But those of us who have studied economics, and certainly those of us who have studied economics more than 20 or 30 years ago, realize just how Orwellian and deceptive is the use of those terms. And yet, exactly for the reasons that Orwell outlined so clearly in 1984, they have become completely dominant, not only in the economic profession, but in the public policy environment, which that profession so powerfully influences. Now, I wrote a book about this issue, which came out roughly 4 years ago at the same time as INET was founded, in which I argued that economic ideas are very powerful, but they also do change. And there is a very close relationship between the evolution of economic ideas, as Keynes suggested, and the evolution of global capitalism. I'm not going to talk in any detail about my book, but let me just explain to you the title of it so that you can go out and buy it, but also why it's so relevant to what we're talking about here today. My book was called Capitalism 4.0, and it argued that in the history of global capitalism, going back to the early part of the 19th century, there have really been 3 stages, and we are now moving into the 4th. And each of these stages has been marked out by an enormous global financial crisis, and also by a shift in economic thinking that crisis produced. Starting with the first, the era of revolutions, 1848, the Communist Manifesto, that gave rise really to the first era of global capitalism, which was marked intellectually on the one hand by the marginalist revolution of Jevons and Mill, and on the other hand by Marxist economics. And it's no coincidence that Marx actually wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Then there was a crisis starting with the Russian Revolution, culminating with the Great Depression in the 1930s. What emerged from that, I would argue, is the second era of global economics, which was one in which government intervention became acceptable for the first time. And that was marked intellectually, of course, first by the work of Keynes, but then in the 50s and 60s by the neoclassical consensus of Keynes and Solow, and the growth theory that emerged from that, the obsession with global growth, which I think is going to be a big subject here. Then came the next revolution, which really began in the late 1960s with the great inflation, with the breakdown of order in much of Europe and the United States, the Black Panthers and so on and so forth, and really culminated with the oil shocks and ultimately with the arrival of Thatcherism and Reaganomics. That was the third phase of economics, marked intellectually, of course, by Milton Friedman, but also by the works of by the concept of rational expectations, an efficient market, Robert Lucas, Eugene Fama, and in the international sphere by the Washington Consensus on Development, on how developed economies should bring themselves up to the level of the industrialized world, and the concept of globalization. That era, that third era of economics and of global capitalism, in my view, began to break down in the middle part of the decade and broke down definitively in the financial crisis of 2007-2008. So what comes next? What comes next in the fourth phase of global capitalism and, I think, economic theory? Well, that's exactly what this inquiry, as Matthew mentioned, this conference is very much an inquiry, is about, and developing this new economics, which will be essential if we want to have a new world order, is the big challenge that we all face today, which is exactly the title of the first session of the talk of this conference. So that